I've been thinking about the idea of hatred, and I think I've got a new definition or way of understanding what it might be, which is that hatred is a kind of resistance to the lesson that the hated person might have to offer. In other words, we probably know secretly that the hated person, the hatee, has something that we don't have, and the thing that they don't have is what we resist. So hatred, among other things, is a form of resistance. And I think what we're resisting in them partly is a lesson that they might have for us that doesn't accord with our own set of values or even our sense of our own identity, and therefore we reject it. And we particularly reject it if there's something about the other person that we feel is completely antithetical to who we feel we are. To complicate that thought a little bit, we could say that that resistance to the lesson the other person holds for us also has an element of what in psychoanalysis is called introjection, or even, in fact, extrojection. That is, there is something about the hated person which contains an aspect of our own personality which we wish to reject or eschew in some way. So what we're hating in the other person is that they are reflecting back to us that bit of ourselves which we least like and therefore would like to expel. And we expel it by extrojecting it rather than introjecting it into the personage of the other, of the hated person. So that's a complication on the idea that really hatred is to do with the resistance to the lesson that the other person might have for us. And after all, we know with all learning and with all lessons that there's a risk of change. It's one reason why we are often resistant to learning from people from different political ideologies. For example, they bring with them a risk that we might have to qualify, potentially even abandon positions that have been dearly held by us over a long period of time, positions with which we might even identify and derive aspects of our own sense of self. So this is my kind of new thought, I suppose, about the notion of hatred, built on earlier thoughts. One is whether the idea that hate is the opposite of love is valid. I mean, obviously at one level it certainly is. I was thinking about Romeo and Juliet, love and hate being brought together. Juliet's famous line, "My only love sprung from my only hate," because Romeo comes from the Montague family, Juliet from the Capulet family. The two families are engaged in a feud. There's ancient enmity between them. They hate one another. And of course, the love that Juliet has for Romeo springs up in the context of that hate. So we have a dramatic opposition between love and hate. But I would say it is, although it's dramatic, it is only dramatic, that opposition, and I don't think it's necessarily conceptually true. I would actually say that if love is a form of affective bonding and energy, the best opposite to love would not be hate, but actually indifference, because that signals the complete depletion, or at least waning of interest in the other person. Whereas hatred is actually much more similar to love in that regard. I would even say hatred is a kind of bond. It keeps the other person in our mind. It exercises us. And arguably, there's even more energy in the feelings around hate than there is around love. Love is a kind of pacific or peaceable form of bonding on the whole, in most cases. Whereas hatred is a kind of restless, perturbing, slightly discombobulating energy, which nevertheless keeps the other person in our heads. And I think, going back to my previous idea that hatred is a resistance to the lessons of others, part of the anger that's wrapped up, I think, in hatred is precisely the fact that we can't expel this person who's got inside our head. So they have a kind of inner presence for us, which is exactly what we wish to expel in some way. And that inner presence, I think, can be described as a form of bond or attachment even to the other person. One other thought I think around this, which I think might be relevant. When we think about love and hate, I would suggest that love, in terms of the sequence and generation development of our lives, is the more primary of the two sensations or affects or feelings. In other words, to use a perhaps weird metaphor, when we're born, our operating system comes with love pre-installed, but I don't think comes with hatred pre-installed. Love, I think, is in that sense the more natural tendency, whereas hatred is that which arrives from a series of experiences. If you take the work of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, for example, who writes a bit about hatred in early infant life, she talks about the feelings of hatred and revenge and anger that a young child, an infant, can have towards, for example, its mother when the mother doesn't feed the baby on time. And then anger, hatred, envy arise, but they arise as a consequence. They're not there, as it were, a priori. They're not there from the beginning. Whereas I think love is that which precedes hate. So you can think of love and hate almost in temporal, time-based relationship to one another. First love, then hate. And building on that thought, you could perhaps say that hatred is a kind of revenge on aborted love. Because you took away the possibility of me loving you, which I might have done, I now therefore hate you. I take my revenge on you because you withdrew the possibility of me loving you. I might have wished to love. That was my default as a human being. But my default as a human being was then somehow corrupted or compromised by something that you did, which I then interpreted as going against what I wished for myself. And with that thought, I think we're back with the first definition I was trying to get to, which is this idea that hatred is a kind of resistance to something that the other person contains or promises or offers to us. And, I'm extending that thought really by saying that hatred is a resistance to the lessons that the other person has to offer. So I refuse their content. I refuse what they have to give me, even though at a certain level I recognize they have their own life, they have their own experience, and they will have done their own more or less conscious, more or less active processing of their own experiences and their world around them in order to arrive at what they are and who they are. And I know at some deep, maybe existential level, that that's no less valid really than my own processing, my own structures, my own theories, my own feelings about the world and how I've developed my own identity. And actually in that regard, I think there's a little bit of jealousy always wrapped up in hatred. I think and to be slightly meta about the whole thing, one of the things that we experience when we hate is that we hate hatred. I mean, there's a famous phrase that James Joyce uses in Ulysses through the figure of Leopold Bloom, the main protagonist. He says that love loves to love love. It's a kind of virtuous circle where it feeds on itself, expands on itself, and so on. I think there's something slightly parallel in the notion of hatred. Hatred, as I was saying, is a discomforting experience. And to that extent, we could say we hate hate. Although some people say we love to hate people, I don't think that's necessarily true. If we got to the point where we're loving the hating, that's more of a pantomime villain type of hatred. But true hatred is a very uncomfortable feeling, and it disturbs us. And to that extent, hatred produces hatred of hatred. That's the meta thought that I'll end with. But the first thought, just to conclude and recap on the beginning, really, is that what hatred might be is a resistance to the lesson that the hated person has for us.